Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to turn off your cell phones, please. If you'd like to get some water, there's some in the back of the room. This program is titled Undue Influence Through the Eyes of the Victimizer. So if that's not what you want to hear, now's the time to get up and go find what you do want to hear. Our presenter today will be Dr. Glenn Hammel. Okay, it looks like everyone's about ready. So I'll just make a brief introduction. Dr. Glenn Hammel's work frequently focuses on protecting the elderly from interpersonal manipulation and the creation of resident well-aging programs and institutional beliefs, emphasizing the enduring essential personhood of the elderly. He holds a doctorate in clinical psychology with postdoctoral fellowship training in neuropsychology. Dr. Hammel was appointed by the California State Senate to the Council on Mentally Ill Offenders. Dr. Hammel has been a speaker at staff training and professional development seminars on issues related to aging, including functional assessment, dementia care, and undue influence, sponsored by organizations such as the American Society on Aging, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the California Assisted Living Facility Association, PFAC, and Young Presidents Organization. He has guest lectured at academic institutions, including the University of California, Northeastern University, and Golden Gate University School of Law. I'd like to present Dr. Hammel.
Whoa, I feel such power now. I really wish you guys wouldn't have clapped, because there's a sense of obligation now that I feel. And it puts me into a tremendous position where already you guys are starting to influence me. Because, I mean, let's be honest, who doesn't like getting applause now and then? Most people go through life feeling that they can just get tolerated. But getting celebrated is not what most people feel all day long. So I appreciate the clap, but I get put into a much more reasonably human state of mind by my children, who rarely ever clap. They've never clapped. I had an experience about 2 months ago. I was getting ready for a lecture on undue influence, and my youngest son, a 9-year-old, was helping me, and I felt such joy because I was able to pontificate with great wisdom about undue influence, and he smiled. And I knew at that moment that he looked at me as being the godlike being I had wanted to be, because that's what parents occasionally would like. And I explained to him about the issues regarding undue influence and elder abuse, and how it relates to things like testamentary capacity and creating a will. And then he said, "Dad," I go, "Yeah," because I want to sound wise. He goes, "About your new bag." And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Can I have it when you die?" Look, I love the child, I really do. And the fact that I sleep with one eye open now doesn't stop me from loving him. It just gives me fear. But it's really amazing how he can influence me. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, the kid makes me feel so good sometimes. And at that moment, I want to do whatever he wants. But he's been doing this from the beginning. I mean, one of the first things that my son learned how to do was to make me smile. Because he would look up at me and he'd smile, and I'd look down and smile, and we'd be like smiling together, because that's what like kids do to make sure that you're not going to leave them too quickly. And it's this wonderful reciprocity of emotion and communication. He understood immediately that he had the power to push me around a bit, to influence me. Now, I knew the same thing. I could hold his food hostage. I didn't do that because I'm a nice guy. But sometimes when your kid is getting out of control, you want to act slightly malevolent, not a lot, but just slightly, and because you want to influence them. And influence comes natural. We all do it. We're each trying to convince somebody else to do something that gets our needs met. Conversely, people are doing it to us all the time. They want us to somehow be able to be there to meet their ends and not just my own. But we start talking about influence up into undue influence. Most people consider this some kind of spectrum of a little bit, a lot of it that makes really strong influence, but if you really get a lot of influence, you get to the undue level. But it really isn't on a spectrum. They're qualitatively different things. In undue influence, as opposed to due influence, surely you're trying to push the person to do something that you want them to do. But with undue influence, it comes with a certain price. Free will. Because free will is what allows you to decide, is something in your interest or not? But the undue influencer doesn't want you to do that. They want to abrogate, to deny you your free agency, your free will. And it usually occurs in a relationship of trust, because that's where we're most vulnerable. A power differential will recognize we're in a power differential. But a trust one, when you sit there with your child, there's trust. Most importantly, them for you. You are sometimes wise not to trust your own children. If I'm going on a common thing here about children, you should know what they did yesterday to me. I don't want to talk about it, but is it aggravating? At any rate, but we have this trust differential. That's why when damage is done by, let's say, a lawyer taking advantage of a client, a priest and a rabbi with a parishioner, a doctor with a patient, it's more than just a power differential. In order for these individuals to get their needs met by the professional, they have to open themselves up in trust. So when undue influence occurs, it most frequently occurs in that relationship of trust. And the horrible truth is that when most of us are thinking about what is the negative impact of undue influence, we usually think in the monetary zone, right? But I would argue that the most profound theft that goes on is the theft of the person's humanity. Because at the core of what it means to be human is the capacity to exercise free will. Undue influence. It usually occurs in the context of an elderly individual, but it need not. There are plenty of examples of undue influence occurring well aside of an elderly person, let alone even a dementia. People often think about this like a puppeteer. Geppetto pulling up the strings on Pinocchio, and that's really not how it works. It's not direct control like that. Nor is it the Manchurian candidate, someone who brainwashes you or puts some kind of device into your brain to make you do stuff. It's interpersonal. Anybody hear of the Stockholm Syndrome? As a small tutorial for those who do not know, which unfortunately it seems there's only like 4 people here. I won't call on you. I don't want to get you embarrassed. The Stockholm Syndrome is an amazing thing. In the early 70s, there was a bank inside of Stockholm that was taken over by 6 bank robbers. There were 3 hostages that were kept there the full length of the time over a 2-day period. And they were belittled, they were put down, they were told that danger could come to them physically. And perhaps most importantly, they were told that if those police officers on the outside come in, they would go die just as much as the bank robbers. Your interest is the same as ours. Eventually, in fact, the bank was assaulted. Nobody died. But a peculiar thing then happened. The individuals who you would expect would voluntarily want to testify against bank robbers refused. And bizarrely, they wanted to visit them in the bank so they could emotionally support them. Amazing notion. They somehow fused the interests of the bank robbers with their own. It's become known as a siege mentality. It's really no different in some respects from that of the case of Patty Hearst in the Sudanese Liberation Army. First, a hostage, eventually someone who, when even given the opportunity to escape, doesn't. Amazing stuff. But the stories of undue influence, of course, for all of us in this room, most assuredly happen, I guess the greatest amount statistically is with the elderly. Elderly individuals who are often conned out of their money by artful manipulators. And part of the tragedy is that they can ill afford usually to lose any of their assets, because they can't earn anymore. So when you steal money from an elderly person, you're not just taking money, you're taking the time and the energy that was put into accruing that money. And they don't have the time, they don't have the energy again to go back into the workforce. So I would argue, as my basic premise today, that inside of each of us is a person who is vulnerable to being unduly influenced. And I would also argue that in each of you is an individual with the capacity to unduly influence another person. When a person engages in undue influence, they pick their target. Somebody who is vulnerable. If I argue that we're all vulnerable, what we're really talking about is a heightened degree of vulnerability. Now, the people in this room, you're primarily fiduciaries. And you're in an incredibly unique place because you are at the center. You're the hub of a whole group of individuals who officially or not officially are part of the allied caregiving team. You're the ones who pull in the data of a case and organize it and play with it and watch how it dynamically interacts with each other far more than anybody else, far more than a psychologist, a physician, far more than the attorney or even a family member. You see how all the parts go together. So for the sake of this particular talk, I know that you're going to have all the answers. I still like to come. I get to see words that I wrote. It's great. If you were to decide to unduly influence somebody, who would you look for?
Someone vulnerable.
What makes you vulnerable?
Maybe their thinking, the way they respond to things, you know that they're not with it.
Not with it. Someone, and this could be, again, this is actually on a continuum, someone who is just suffering normative age-related cognitive declines, someone who may not be at all have a dementia or malfunction brain, someone who's depressed. An elderly person who's depressed often expresses it in what they call a pseudo-dementia. It's not really a dementia organically, but man, it smells, tastes, and looks like one. Yes?
Someone who's isolated from other family support systems.
Lonely. You're going to get too good at this. Let's be very frank about this. You go out there unduly influenced. Don't leave their law back to me. You were able to self-supply that. Yes.
Somebody who is obviously not knowledgeable, somebody not necessarily ignorant, or stupid. But
Naive.
there we go.
It's a lovely term. I like using that with my kids. You're being naive, as opposed to, how did I give birth to such an idiot? What were you going to say?
Somebody that has resources to influence, or somebody that has.
So, but yes, but we're talking about the victim. So in your case, you're saying that but it would also apply. Someone with something we're stealing. Come on. You guys are good at this.
Somebody who has problems, obvious problems.
What do you mean by problems?
They can't pay their taxes on their house.
Ah.
So they have a problem. They think they're going to lose the house.
Which could be realistic or not realistic, but they do feel this inherent sense of groundlessness, literally in that case, sense of loss.
Who feels that they can't get a reverse mortgage, that they have no mortgage to reverse.
And if there's that thing that we talked about being confused, it's really very hard to be proactive or even expediently reactive to a situation that you can barely comprehend. When we look at a dementia, everybody always thinks about memory loss, but there's, in addition to memory problems, there's also diminished in what they call executive functions. Your ability to reason through something, organized thinking, mental flexibility, being able to think that thought and say, well, let me consider another perspective. Word finding problems. How to even express. When we talk about word finding, it's not just communication between me and you, it's also within myself. Our thinking is comprised of words. Anybody else, what would make a good victim?
Somebody wants to feel better and you make them feel better.
Ah, you're right. Feeling better. When somebody gets older, there's often an increased need for solace and comfort, stability. If you can somehow offer that, boy, you got power. You and her, you're going to get me in trouble. Yes, you had something to say. You have nothing to say?
Someone who needs something, has a need.
Has a need.
That's my answer.
It's a good need. No, but that's actually right on the money. Because there's something that they need is another way of saying there's something that you can be there to provide. Yes?
Did anyone say someone who's living in fear or fearful, or it kind of goes along with some of those other...
I think it goes along with the other things, but I think you put your finger right on it just by saying for a moment the common statement of there's fear involved, there's anxiety. You know, when somebody feels fear or anxiety, it don't matter if it's real or not, the basis for it. You feel it, then that kicks in the fight, flight, and paralysis response. And when that gets going, your thinking's all a blur. If I wake you up at 2 in the morning and I scream at you, fire, you'll get out of that bed quick. You'll be outside. Because that's the way we react. But if I said, it's 2 in the morning, quick, do your taxes. Before you kick the crap out of me, you would, yes, you can't do it well. Yes?
How about somebody that's addicted, has an addiction?
An addiction. Alcohol. And gambling. So when we deal with an addiction, it could be neurophysiological, right? So, which has its own negative consequence on your brain. But it could also just be a psychological compulsiveness. You're talking about gambling. And that puts us into a whole new realm, because then it's a question of who's going to be able there to facilitate it or not, which goes back to what you were saying about need. Yes? Greedy. So what you're touching on is actually very frequently done in telephone solicitations, right? Which can, I mean, all this stuff interacts, right? If you're fearful about losing a home or not having enough money, that scam that you're getting doesn't smell like a scam. It smells like blessings from heaven. Yes?
A person who has an emotional void or a sense of emptiness, something that needs to be fulfilled.
That an interesting notion you put, though, because we've talked about need, but you put your finger right on something about emotional emptiness. One of the things that happens as you get older is that which gave you vitality, not just physically, but emotionally, that galvanized you, a sense of a calling, a mission perhaps, or just the feelings of satisfaction by being part of the flow around you and your family, that can be diminished. And so suddenly somebody says, guess what? I get your passion again. Excitement. Now, there's a couple of problems with this. The other day I go and I'm assessing an elderly man, 89 years old, wife died, but don't worry, because 5 months ago, true love came in a 51-year-old caregiver. Don't worry, you're still turning me on. God, I feel great when I'm with you. And he loved to hear that. Unfortunately, in that case, it was also physical abuse she was doing on him. But that vitality, I've recently come to recognize that I love curses. Because when I'm with my kids, every time I try to be hip and use one of their terms, it's usually a malapropism, and I'm using it wrongly. And I know that you guys probably already knew this, but I was kind of just let in on the issue. The word sick doesn't refer to a physiological pathology. They said, that's sick. I said, oh, I'm sorry. And it's okay, because just when I learned something, I'm 2 generations late. I'm no longer saying cool. It's no longer cool to say cool. There's another generation. But I find that curses are immortal. Shit meant shit in 65, and 75, and 85, and God willing till I die, because I need the words. But there is a sense of being part of significance, culturally or interpersonally, that makes you feel that you're part of the flow, that has an emotional characteristic to it. Yes?
I was very surprised at an FBI lecture I was at that surprisingly, the people most ripped off, I don't know whether it was online or where, were white, male, educated people. I was shocked.
At what age are we talking about? You're right. Aha. Okay.
But I think that's kind of an arrogance.
No, it's not an arrogance. It's an interesting thing that, yes, could be arrogant, but there's a whole bunch more than when we look at that stat. Because at the age of 65, 64, 66, a man retires. And in previous generations, things are shifting markedly, obviously, but their identity was fused into what they did, how much they earned. But the woman, she was a homemaker, a mother, a daughter-in-law, a mother-in-law, a wife. Roles that don't end at a particular year. So there's a sense of continuity of purpose, which males very often would lose. A man is what he is, not what he used to be. And the sense that you're alone, that you're no longer with purpose, and all perhaps ratcheted up to the fears we're talking about here. It makes you a really vulnerable mark, if only because you don't want to get off the phone. And you'd like to believe you're still hustling and making the big deal. Anybody else? Come on. Who would you look at to say this is a person to take advantage of? Yes?
Someone distracted, like with pain?
Ah, you're good. No, I say this because I have only recently recognized it myself. And in that pain, physical or psychological, makes everybody distracted. It also makes us all narcissistic, right? We're just focusing in on how we're suffering at the moment. Yes? Guilt. Say more.
Well, you know, what if you need to provide for your family, you need to do something that you would wish you could do, but don't have the money to, so you say, okay, I have an opportunity to fix things, I'm guilty of.
Right, so this is a way of undoing. You know what, I'm interested, there's nobody who's really brought this up yet, but what about physical dependency? Obviously, remember, the probate code in California, 811 and 812, doesn't demand a label, a diagnosis. We're looking at functional expressions. And that's all the cognitive, but physically, we know what it means to be reliant on someone else, to have even mortality fears that can come up. If we don't have you, I'll die. So your ability to me to psychologically mind meld with you is incredible. And along with that, one of the things that happens as we get older for everybody is sensory diminishment. Get older, the hearing doesn't work as well. The eyesight, not as acute. Taste. That's why if you ever go to assisted living and you eat the food, it seems so heavily seasoned. It has to be. People want to taste it. Skin, the biggest sense organ we got. Just when we lose our sense of tactile acuity, we don't get the hugs we need. Just out of curiosity, if I was to ask you to make a choice between blindness or deafness, which would you take? Deaf. Deaf, you. Blindness, you're an outlier. Yes. Deaf, blindness, okay, you're both outliers. At a certain point, you're no longer outliers. But it'll tell you, it'll happen soon. Anybody else? Deaf? All right. I can't say there's a wrong or right answer. But I'm going to strongly insinuate right now. Deafness is a far worse thing to have than blindness. You can't believe? Let me make the argument. If you still disagree, I am willing to, acquiesce. Okay, here it goes. Okay, first, just on a pure physiological level, we know that blindness is a 180-degree loss. Deafness is 360. That has nothing to do with anything, but I like saying it. Now, but blindness takes you out of a world of objects. True. Awful. But even if I'm blind, I can still know how to do this. I can put my mouth here, I can pull it away, and I can hear the feedback of not having this voice as strong. I'm not being a good advocate that I want to be blind, but it takes us out of a world of objects. Deafness takes us out of a world of people. You can see them, but you can't communicate as easily with them. Trust me, I know this frankly better than most people. But, I got eyes like you wouldn't believe. God forbid, this is not a Cat Stevens song about if I lose my, but let's be frank about this. a lot of the things that make you vulnerable here we're talking interpersonal realities of loneliness, for example, and not having purpose. Yes?
I am partially deaf. I've worn hearing aids all my life, and I can tell you when I take them out, I lose relationships when I can't hear.
You hear this? I'm right, you're wrong. She said so. No. It is obviously a personal judgment call, and God forbid you should lose either. I mean,
When you're blind, you're physically at risk. You can't go as many places and feel comfortable. So you're isolated more, and the fear.
well,
Fear that's created as you don't have things around you.
I would argue my father-in-law is going deaf, and he feels more isolated because he feels like he cannot communicate with the people he wants to communicate, and he ends up being more isolated than as he's now starting to lose his eyesight. He feels personally he wished he would have become blind before he ever.
but we pull back to what we're talking about and looking at these two issues, one couldn't argue that either of these things is going to do anything but make you more vulnerable to manipulations interpersonally.
But this day and age, there's so much criminality going on. I mean, just.
Well, okay, then let's switch that around. Who is able to be victimized? The person who has already been victimized, who's already been a victim of crime. Look, we can go on and on. A great victim, pick someone who's suffering from PTSD. I deal with a lot of child Holocaust survivors. They did great throughout their life. They were able to keep sense of personal strength. They were able to raise families. They were able to do great things professionally, and yet somehow as they become more vulnerable at the later years, all that stuff can't be contained. It comes running up to the surface. Mental illness makes you more vulnerable. Paranoia. I know you're right. They're all out there. They're going to try to get you, but you know something? Don't worry. I'll be right next to you. They're going to have to go through me to get to you. No way. You just cultivate the person's paranoia. Odd, isn't it? Because we would have thought that someone who is paranoid would be, in fact, more protected. One thing that nobody has said here, and I'm kind of amazed. Who would make a good victim? A person who no longer feels needed by others. I went into an assisted living community a few years back, and there was who was it? I'm trying to remember the name of the place, but you know you go into these places and you first get that smell of some of the lesser quality ones of cleanser bursting in through my nostrils, and I walk in, and there's the foyer, you have everybody in wheelchairs, and they're looking up to see who's going to walk through the door. Nobody ever comes to see them, but there's hope. And I go into this place, and what I see is really kind of amazing. They got a 12-year-old girl who is just enjoying talking with and entertaining the troops like a miniature Bob Hope, and she's there telling a joke. I remember her even actually dancing and smiling and singing, and the people just lit around her. So finally I go up and I say, "Excuse me, I notice you here. Is your grandparent here?" "No." "Do you have a parent who's working here?" She said, "No." I said, "My apologies, but why are you coming here?" And she said, "I just like to help." About 25 or so minutes later, she comes up to me with this dyspeptic look of like a French philosopher who's ate a nasty piece of escargot. Very concerned. And she says, "Well, Dr. Hammel, I'm a bit concerned about something." I said, "What is it?" She goes, "Well, I really like to come here." I said, "That's great. No, no, you don't understand. I really like to come here and help out. I said, that's wonderful. I'm glad. She goes, well, I saw something on Dr. Phil. Am I codependent? It's amazing. We have managed to pathologize the very human need to be needed, to be of value to others. Various anxieties are going to come and go throughout your lifetime. But the one that's likely to remain is, am I of value to others? Humans just don't want to have their ends met. They want to be a means to an end. They just want to be fulfilled. They want to be able to fulfill another, not just satisfied, but to be able to satisfy another. All animals have needs. But again, humans are unique in that we have a need to be needed. Unfortunately, the populations that we're talking about, who's vulnerable? The person who no longer feels needed by others. I am so appreciative that you've taken me in and let me caregive you for the rest of your life. I will be happy to do it. Thank you for helping me and my family out in this way. I'm sure the will hold up. You know, it's amazing. Okay, so you guys do an excellent job of recognizing the perfect mark. After recognizing comes the next step, enhancing. They're the enhancers, the things that you can do to make the person even more malleable. Anybody want to throw out an idea of what you could do to really make this sucker work, to make things go in the direction you want, and not necessarily what's in the interest of the other person? Tell me more. What do you mean by dependent?
Well, if they have a need, try to supply the need. If they emotionally, physically, try to fill that void, either emotionally, physically, the sensory, any kind of sensors, you know.
So you be the person who's there in the middle, who can be giving stuff. And I would take that. Now let's go to what often happens. You've got this psychological and physical dependency going on. And on the other hand, you start creating that siege mentality. Nobody's here but me. I love you. Your kids don't. They would be here if they loved you. They're at a distance. And then you make disparaging remarks, putting them down. What other things would you do to isolate somebody, if you could? How would you cut them off from other people?
Not allow them to have visitors, family visitors, neighbors, not even a flower delivery.
You're absolutely right. That's some of the ways that are done. I'll even increase that, say, mail, phone, internet, not giving access. You become the sole conduit of the rest of the world. What other things can you do if you really want to enhance the situation to make somebody more malleable? Yes? Affection. It goes back to what I was talking about, hugs and touch. When an infant isn't given affection or contact, something terrible occurs. Did anybody hear about the old Romanian orphan studies? Right? They left the infants and the toddlers without human contact, really. And you discover an interesting thing when you're dealing with kids at that age. Absence does not make the heart grow fonder. It makes it go frozen. And so somebody that can thaw that out, such power. You had something.
Feed their fears.
Somewhat like I was talking before about the paranoia. You're right, you could lose this house. So don't worry, don't spend the money on any more caregivers. I'll stay here and take care of you. Manipulate. Anybody else, any great ideas what you could do? flattery. You're right.
We have one situation where the lady was taken for over $200,000 in a year, and she lived alone, had her family all over the country, loved men, would go to farmer's market and pick up men, and picked up some men she shouldn't have, and they actually, the son needed surgery, this one needed something.
Aye.
And they flattered her. This is a woman who needs to be needed, who is always a kind person, and was very interested in men. Was a widow.
It's a very flattery will get you very far in life. It will get you far. It will definitely get you far. And flattery works in part because it's true. You noticed, I know that about myself. And that works great. It's more problematic when you're trying to go over the hurdle of somebody's looking at you, go, excuse me? You think I'm nice? I'm not nice. But if you can find a way of flattering what the person already believes about themselves. Okay. You guys clearly show a capacity to unduly influence somebody in terms of recognizing who would be a good mark, about using different techniques. So, if you all have this capacity, the same capacity that your clients have to be a victim, the same capacity that the victimizers had, what separates you from them? Why aren't the people here engaging in undue influence for fun and for profit? Why not? Okay, so there's a reward and punishment model. If I do this, there's a consequence that be very adverse. Okay, that's one way of doing it. Anybody else? Why don't you do it? Integrity, moral, ethics.
Knowing what's right and wrong.
I agree with you completely. No problem. Why is it that people don't become undue influencers?
Knowing what's right and wrong. Knowing what's right and wrong.
The moral judgment. I have to admit that the reward punishment model, the idea that if I screw up, the courts are going to come down on me or I can lose my licensure, I sometimes cynically trust in that more than the moral choice. But I think that, God willing, everybody in this room is really operating on that ethical demand.
There are also some cultural differences and variances. Cultural, and the way certain cultures view opportunity or their personal situation.
You're right, there is definitely different, but there is, I find no culture that would argue that very cynically that they should take advantage of somebody. They may have a different notion of what is transactional. I'll take care of you, here's what you'll do in response. That, you're very right, can be culturally contextualized. However, to some level, theft, fraud, this can happen with most people saying it's a bad thing. Remember, we've had, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, well, this is a particular situation. The family was Indian, and the couple had a son, married, and they had a child. The husband and wife separated. The husband left. The daughter-in-law and the grandson were living in the home. The daughter-in-law moved the parents to the garage. They slept on the floor. It wasn't heated. They had access to the house, to the half bathroom, and they threatened them that they would never see their grandson again if they messed up the deal.
That's not cultural. Just trust me on this one. I spend a lot of time doing consulting in India, and admittedly, India is not one culture or one language, but yeah, there is that silence that can happen. You're right. I would look. This is not when we talk about undue influence.
I believe that
Yes.
an innate global nature to believe in the golden rule. What separates me from a scammer is that I believe I want to treat someone as I would like to be treated.
I think that you're right about that. I would also say that we have common stories that we are able to tell ourselves that speak to that common belief about what is right and what is wrong. One of the earliest legal cases of undue influence, I'm thinking some of you may have heard of this one. It was in a family situation. Remember, undue influence most often occurs in a familial dynamic. And in this situation, you're dealing with a son who, while loved, was not in his father's favor, to the point where the majority of the estate was to be left and known to be left to the other brother, or to the brother. And the father had been one of those very strong, almost domineering sort of people in the family, and yet as he got considerably older and more enfeebled and had blindness was with him, the little power he had was over who to give this money to. The fear. And the family really split. The older brother was his father's favorites. The younger one was the mom's. And very directly, they engaged in a fraud and conned the father into believing that, in fact, it wasn't the younger son that was dealing with him, it was the older one. Remember, he's blind, so it's hard to have told. And that story has resonated for generations. It's the story of Jacob, Esau, and Isaac. Ain't nothing new under the sun, as they say. So, given everything we're describing, and I'm looking at the time, oh, it's going quick. So, I have 15 slides to do, 400 of them. Okay, let's see. Patty Hearst case, okay, let's go through this. There's one thing I really wanted to read you guys. And this is from a case in 1960 from the estate of Ferris in California. Undue influence is not something that can be seen, heard, smelt, or felt. Its presence can only be established by proof of circumstances from which it may be deduced. In other words, you're not going to look at an MRI, CAT scan, fMRI, naked eye. You cannot see undue influence. You're looking at circumstantial evidence, which again, as fiduciaries, you are in the best place to be able to collect all the different pieces of data and pull them together. No other person in the allied care team is going to have communication and interaction with all the individuals who have that data. So when we start doing this, there is an incredible ethical obligation upon each of you. Not merely because of what you know, but because of how that knowledge will likely to be used. Whether we're talking about a contested conservatorship or something criminal, what usually happens in some respect is the court is balancing an individual's right of autonomy and society's duty to protect. And it's a real balancing act. And so the information that you gather is critical to establishing how the court will balance that. So, If you were to look at a situation, now we're pulling you back. You're no longer going to abuse somebody. You're back in your roles. You're here working professionally. What would you do? What would you see on the outside that would give you pause and say, that could be undue influence?
Sometimes how they express or interpret a situation.
So if they're expressing something that doesn't seem reasonable, like they found true love at 89 with the 51 caregiver who just moved in, yeah. If it smells bad. I really appreciate you asking me to say it again. Because very often people don't ask the question, and it's good to do so. What I was asking about is, what would you, if you were going to look at a situation and try to say, I wonder if, and maybe, there's undue influence, what would be some of the telltale signs that you would look for? A person who's isolated. But isolated alone within what context? How could you, there's a lot of people isolated, there's no undue influence, they're merely isolated. So if you were to look at a dynamic between two people, what would be some of the telltale signs of undue influence? What? Excessive amounts of time seems kind of unnatural. What?
Codependency.
An interesting codependency. Something about the interpersonal relationship doesn't seem right. Yes?
I would say a variety of stories from the people involved. So if you have children, they're telling you a little different story. Mom's telling you a different story. The gardener's telling you something else.
It seems as if there's no coherent truth. If it don't fall together and hold together, maybe because there's nothing that's holding it together. Something's going on. Yes? A stranger, a new acquaintance perhaps, has entered into their life and given a degree of trust that seems odd for a person who's a new acquaintance or a new friend coming in. Yes?
A sudden and drastic change in behavior.
A sudden and drastic change in behavior. That's an amazingly amorphous notion. So I'm going to pull it because I think you're right. But a dramatic change. And we could look at that in, as we were talking about, as somebody coming into their life and things shifting quickly, getting married, just changing where they're living. Spending patterns, new religion, after a lifetime in something else. Taken to a new doctor, taken to a new attorney. Taken away from you, we're going to get somebody to replace you as a conservator. Somebody that might be more malleable. Yes?
Large gifts.
Large gifts. Now I have to tell you, I got this wonderful sign in the back. It said 5 minutes. So there's a whole bunch I haven't told you, and it's really great. You'll never know. But let me just quickly wrap it up by saying this. First of all, you're right. Everybody's saying right. There's a few telltale signs that weren't mentioned. Like if you suddenly see checks being made out in even dollars. You suddenly see someone who becomes more enfeebled, more dependent, more believing that, but for that person, they couldn't do anything. They'd be bereft of any help. So I'm going to jump to one last thing in the 4 minutes we got remaining. What the bloody hell to do about this beyond the legal mechanisms? We all are experts. Great. We understand when we call the attorney or APS, fine. But you've got somebody now that you've made safe, they're secure, you're in there. You know what you're doing. The court knows what's going on. Everybody's doing it. So what do you do psychologically with that person? How can you, in essence, pull their personality out of seeing the world through the abuser's eyes and bring them into your world again, to give them a sense of renewed self-efficacy, of capacity?
But they may not be experiencing a lack of capacity.
No, they may not. It could be any number of things, like disillusionment. There could be a number of reverberations from this. What I would argue, though, and with 3 minutes now, boy, do I get the power. I got power, man. This is great. What I told the girl, I said, no, you're not codependent. I said, you like coming, and that's beautiful. But if you really want to do something for them that would be such a gift, ask them to tell you a joke, to sing you a song. Ask them for help with your homework. Not just engage them. Engagement is one thing. I'm taking it to a step beyond that. Engage them in a sense that they are of value. They are needed, not because of the money they're going to give.
They're in more control.
They have control over their life because they are of value. They are needed for something beyond a dollar or a possession, that they are interpersonally needed. And if you can do that, honestly, not only can you repair some damage, but perhaps even undo years of feeling as if they were merely being tolerated and not celebrated. Validated. But a particular kind of purpose. And socially. You know, we can have purposes that have nothing to do with each other. I know because I smoke cigars. Trust me, nobody wants to be near me. But it gives my life purpose and meaning. But what we're talking about exactly is what happens so that they feel a sense that they are needed by others. Listen, I really want to thank you all for listening to this, because you have absolutely no idea how important I think the subject is. And you will increasingly find clients who have endured this, because the stats seem to be increasing literally each year. And that's how you made me feel here, so I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Remember to fill out your evaluation form and leave it at the back of the room before you leave.
I will give you part of